Elizabeth Tudor could face bishops, ambassadors, parliament, and a kingdom still raw from fear, but one private smile toward Robert Dudley could cost her more than a foreign army ever did. When she took the crown, England did not hand her a seat. It handed her a strain. Damp stone, bad sleep, candle stubs burning low over papers thick with warning, advice, demand. The realm wanted steadiness. It wanted religion settled, it wanted money found, it wanted peace abroad and obedience at home. Most of all, in that hungry, nosing, deeply intrusive way kingdoms had, it wanted to know who would have her body and what child might come of it. And in the middle of all that iron business there was Robert Dudley. He was not her policy, he was not her treaty, he was not one more foreign name carried in on fine parchment with a seal and a pedigree. He was the man who could come near without turning every word into ceremony. He could make her laugh when laughter itself had become political. He could speak plainly in rooms where everybody else spoke as if stepping over knives. He had known danger. He had known court life at close quarters. He knew how quickly favour rose and how much quicker it broke its neck. That was part of the trouble. He stood near enough to be useful, then near enough to be noticed, then near enough for everyone to start counting. Courts always counted. They counted who entered first and who left last. They counted glances, pauses, invitations, saddle rides, the placing of a hand at a doorway. They counted velvet sleeves brushing too close in the privy chamber. They counted laughter through half-shut doors. They counted how often a queen called for one man rather than another, and once they had counted it, they gave it a meaning. If they did not know the truth, they made one. There was never a shortage of that commodity at court. And Elizabeth's court, for all its silk and gold and polished bows, was still a place of boots on cold floors and eyes in every wall crack. Ambassadors watched her as if they meant to price her. Councillors watched her as if they meant to preserve her. Courtiers watched her because they were bored, ambitious, cruel, or all three before dinner. So when Robert Dudley became not merely a servant of the crown, but a familiar presence, people did not shrug and carry on. They leaned in. At first the thing seemed almost ordinary, if you were foolish enough to call anything ordinary where a queen was concerned. She had taken power young, unmarried, and under inspection from half of Europe. Why should she not cling to one person who made the burden lighter? Why should she not keep near one face that did not look at her as a broodmare, an alliance, a threat, or a prize? Because she was not allowed the luxuries hidden inside that question. That was why. A king might have favourites and leave the world to grumble. A queen had to endure a harsher arithmetic. Warmth in a man could pass for charm. Warmth in a woman, especially a ruling woman, was taxed like a public weakness. One careless softness in her could be called appetite. One marked preference could be called surrender. One man, too, near her person could be made to seem near her judgment, too. And England did not merely want Elizabeth married, it wanted her usefully married. This was where the screws turned. Suitors came not as men, but as packages. A foreign prince meant one danger, an English noble meant another. A Catholic husband might alarm Protestants, a Protestant husband might provoke Europe. A great alliance could buy peace. The wrong alliance could buy war. Councillors spoke of succession, security, dynastic stability, national interest. Parliament buzzed about heirs. Foreign envoys dipped their pens and wrote home about every motion of her face. Marriage was not romance, marriage was machinery, which left Dudley in the worst possible position. He was the one man she seemed to want, and the one man England could least bear to see preferred, not because he lacked charm. God help them, he had charm enough, not because he lacked nerve. Nobody accused Robert Dudley of that. But because an English favourite raised by a queen's affection did not look like a husband, he looked like access, he looked like influence, he looked like one faction reaching through the bedchamber and laying hands on the state. That was the fear under all the polished language, not merely that Elizabeth loved him if she did, but that love might become government by another route. You could feel that fear in council chambers before dawn, in the scrape of benches, in gloved fingers smoothing the same paper twice before speaking, in those careful, bloodless phrases powerful men used when they meant, "This feels dangerous, and if you make me say it plainly, I shall." "Your Majesty," one councillor might have said in that level, maddening voice of constitutional concern, "the realm requires not only affection in its sovereign, but confidence in her choice." And Elizabeth, who was rarely slower than the room around her, would have heard the whole sentence inside the sentence. Not only affection, not him. She knew what they saw. She knew what foreign ambassadors reported. She knew that every delay in naming some grand husband from abroad gave Dudley's enemies more room to whisper that the decision had already been made in private. Even when she kept options open, Europe read preference. Even when she performed availability, the court smelt attachment. And then there was the harder fact. Robert Dudley was not free. His wife, Amy Robsart, still lived, not as a romantic inconvenience, not as a footnote, as a legal, breathing, immovable truth. However much the court dressed itself in fantasy, however often gossip ran ahead of decency, there she was, the living barrier between desire and any respectable road toward marriage. That made the whole business uglier. As long as Amy lived, Elizabeth and Dudley could not become a marriage question without first becoming a moral one. Their enemies did not need proof of anything dramatic. They only needed the shape of impropriety. A married man too close to the queen, a queen too fond of a married man. That was sufficient fuel for 1,000 dark little hearths of talk across England and Europe alike. Still, hope had a way of surviving where prudence would have preferred it dead. Perhaps time would shift something. Perhaps circumstances would change. Perhaps closeness could remain only closeness and not ripen into disaster. Courts lived on, perhaps. Whole reigns did. Then Amy Robsart died, and the road cleared, and that was the end of it, because the one event that should have opened the way instead drowned it in suspicion. Her death came too neatly for comfort and too profitably for innocence, at least in the minds of men already inclined to believe the worst. No verdict of gossip ever needed evidence proportionate to the damage it could do. It needed appetite, and there was appetite enough. The court had been primed for months, perhaps years, to think of Dudley as the man who might rise by Elizabeth's favour. Once Amy was gone, people did not see a path freed. They saw a path stained. Whispers thickened at once. Not all whispers deserved belief. That was never the point. The point was that they existed, multiplied, travelled, nested in letters, spread through chapels and courts and foreign embassies, and once spread, they altered the shape of what was politically survivable. An ambassador, dry as dust and twice as poisonous, might note that marriage to Dudley now appeared impossible, not because affection had faded, but because the scandal had become too gross to ignore. A councillor might bow and speak of appearances. A foreign court might recoil. Enemies might grin into their cups and thank Providence for the gift. Because now, if Elizabeth married him, it would not look like constancy rewarded after a sad accident. It would look reckless, tainted, hungry. It would look as though the Queen of England had let private appetite drag public honour through the rushes. No ruler survived that sort of story unmarked. No female ruler survived it cheaply. So this was the true trap. Before Amy's death, Dudley was impossible in one way. After it, he was impossible in another far worse way. Before, the obstacle was plain. After, it was poison. You could imagine Elizabeth understanding that in fragments rather than one grand speech. In a private chamber with the fire burning low and useless. In the ache behind the eyes after too little sleep. In the weight of jewels at her neck while her stomach went cold. In the slow recognition that time was not going to cleanse this. Time might soften noise. It would not alter structure. Dudley's name and danger were now stitched together. Perhaps he still spoke boldly. He was made that way. Perhaps he still believed that favour, patience, or nerve might carry them through. Men near power often mistook endurance for solvability. "Let them talk," he might have said, too sure of himself by half. They always talked. And Elizabeth, who had learned young exactly what talk could become, would have known better. "They talked," she might have answered, quiet as a blade laid on a table. "Now they count." That was the difference. Rumour had hardened into consequence. Dudley was no longer merely the man she might have chosen against advice. He had become the man whose very nearness forced everyone else to ask whether the Queen was being governed through preference. Every office he held, every favour he received, every hour at her side fed the same accusation. Not love exactly, but influence, access, a faction with a handsome face. And Dudley, to make matters worse, was not so simple a creature as a pure martyr to romance. He was intimate, yes, brave at times, yes, magnetic certainly, but he was also a courtier bred in the hard school of advancement. Ambition clung to him as naturally as scent clung to leather after rain. That did not make feeling false. It made it dangerous. Elizabeth could trust him, and still know that trust itself had become combustible, so she reached the cruelest understanding available to her. She could not safely marry him, but she could not cleanly lose him either. That was the compromise, the wound dressed and kept alive. She kept him near enough to matter, near enough that old talk never fully died, near enough that his place remained a question men still resented and women still measured, but she did not make him husband. She did not give England the spectacle it feared. She did not let private desire become public form. It sounded like control. It was, in fact, a long discipline of pain, because a clean severing would have been simpler. Cast him out, and the story ended in one sharp cut. Marry him, and the story ended in catastrophe or triumph, but at least it ended. This arrangement did neither. It preserved affection without fulfillment, closeness without safety, loyalty without rest. It asked both of them, in different ways, to live inside the bruise. And Elizabeth had always been better than most people at living inside discomfort without showing the full cost of it. That was part of her genius. She turned denial into style, strategy into pageant, loneliness into iconography. She dressed the lack. She made a kingdom watch the performance of sovereign wholeness, while the private woman beneath it went hungry in very ordinary ways. Hungry for ease, hungry for trust, hungry for one room in which she did not have to be England before she could be herself. But that was not a room the crown meant to give her. So in public, she became more than a woman ought to have been allowed to become in that age. She became image, policy, ceremony, survival. She learned the use of delay. She learned the power of being courted without yielding. She learned how to keep Europe interested, councillors off balance, subjects reassured, and rivals uncertain. She did not marry. Or rather, she married the thing that had already taken her whole. The crown got the vow. Dudley got the remainder. Not nothing, never nothing, but not the thing itself. That was the tragedy, not that she failed once and lost him. It was that she succeeded repeatedly and had to refuse him again and again in different forms, in policy, in appearance, in timing, in symbolism, in every hard little choice by which a reign was kept from tipping sideways. England praised her for mastery, and perhaps rightly. She did master it. She kept the kingdom steadier than many expected. She outlasted enemies, maneuvered suitors, and made a weapon of her own unclaimed body. She won, and winning hurt, because this was not one of those love stories ended by lack of feeling or distance or ignorance. It was ended by surveillance, by consequence, by the savage fact that for a queen affection did not remain affection. It became evidence, then leverage, then risk. Robert Dudley stayed near enough to remind her of what she had denied. Elizabeth stayed great enough to deny it. That was how the thing endured. Not as a marriage, not as a clean loss, as a permanent ache arranged into policy, and that in the end was the most pitiless part of it all. She could rule England, command lords, steady faith, face down Europe, and wear majesty like armour, but she could not safely take the one man she most wanted and call him hers, because the moment marriage became imaginable was the exact moment it became impossible.